everyone. Welcome to our update on the ongoing civil unrest in Hong Kong. My name is Mary Chapman, Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware, and I'll be your moderator for the briefing. I would now like to introduce Brendan O'Reilly, Intelligence Analyst for Asia Pacific at WorldAware. Brendan has spent most of his adult life living and working in China, India, and New Zealand. A variety of publications, including Asia Times, The Diplomat, and the BBC, have featured Brendan's geopolitical analysis. His main areas of expertise are China's foreign policy and its domestic socio-political dynamics. Brendan is going to provide an update on the current status of the civil unrest in Hong Kong. Brendan?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join this live briefing. I know this is a major area of client concern and interest, and especially with the situation ongoing and the political dynamics being what they are. On September 4th, Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced that the government would withdraw a controversial bill that has sparked months of large and disruptive protests in Hong Kong. The Fugitive Offenders Bill would have allowed the extradition of criminal suspects from Hong Kong to mainland China on a case-by-case basis. Now, despite the withdrawal of the bill, protests have continued in Hong Kong. But we've seen a change in the dynamics here. So the large mainstream announced in advance protests are continuing, but they're generally drawing smaller participants, fewer participants than they were back in June and July. So during large protests in June and July, we would see hundreds of thousands of people protesting on the weekends. Whereas now in the mainstream protests, you might see thousands to tens of thousands of participants. The other change in dynamic that we've seen is that during the, in addition to the mainstream protests, we're seeing more unannounced spontaneous rallies, and we are seeing more violence at those protests. Why are the protests continuing since the government has withdrawn the bill that sparked the protests in the first place? Well, the protest movement is maintaining four key demands here. The first is the resignation of Chief Executive Carrie Lam. Protesters are also seeking the release of all arrested activists. Another key demand is they want to set up an independent inquiry into alleged police brutality during the recent demonstrations. And finally, they also want universal suffrage in all Hong Kong elections going forward. As I mentioned previously, we've seen generally less participation at the mainstream protests that are announced in advance by mainstream groups. At the same time, we've seen an escalation in tactics, let's say disruptive or violent tactics, at the unannounced spontaneous rallies. What we've seen specifically are incidences of arson, specifically flaming barricades in the street, people throwing Molotov cocktails, and some targeting of businesses that are perceived to be pro-Beijing. By targeting, I mean smashing window fronts for the most part. And of course, throwing projectiles at riot police. Specifically, one thing that we have seen which impacts the situation on the ground is that protesters have been increasingly targeting Hong Kong's mass transit railway or MTR facilities because they perceive the MTR as being as basically colluding with the police in order to crack down on the demonstrations. When we're analyzing the situation on the ground in Hong Kong, we need to keep in mind the motivations and the strategies that are being employed by both the protest movement and by the government. For the protesters, we've seen a deliberate effort to escalate actions to be more disruptive in order to put additional pressure on the government for the government to meet their four remaining demands. And we've also even seen some activists who are trying to spark some sort of counter move by the police. Basically, they want to escalate violence with the hope that increasing violence gives more sympathy to the protest movement. Essentially, what they're doing is appealing to public opinion in Hong Kong. Now, the government move is also to appeal to public opinion in Hong Kong, but in a different way. On the tactical side of things, they are trying to identify and arrest the more hardcore disruptive protesters. So we've seen in recent weeks, for example, police deploying water cannons with blue dye in the water cannons, with the hope that you could spray, crowds of people and then, subsequently identify people who are protesting and arrest them. More broadly, the government hopes that the protest movement will gradually lose steam, firstly because the main demand that sparked these protests has already been met, but also with the hope that disruptions and some economic unease associated with the protest movement might alienate more of the Hong Kong population. Speaking of the sentiment of the Hong Kong population, because obviously that's really the most important factor going forward, something that's not been, I think, adequately covered in a lot of media is actual opinion polls from Hong Kong. So what we're looking at here is results of a question which was asked during in a telephone survey in early September. Respondents were specifically asked who they blame for escalating clashes between the protesters and the police. And the respondents were able to choose multiple answers if they so desired. As you can see here, a little bit more than half of the respondents blamed the Hong Kong government for escalating clashes. Fairly significant portions also blamed the Hong Kong police, the central government in Beijing. Some people are also, of course, blaming the protesters themselves. Some people are blaming foreign influence, and smaller numbers are blaming mainstream pan-democratic parties or pro-Beijing parties. This isn't on the infographic here, but during the same poll, about 2/3 of respondents said that they believed police had used excessive force at the protests, while 40% thought that protesters had similarly been too violent. So what my read here is that there's still a lot of sympathy for the protest demands, but at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that the populace as a whole is broadly supportive of some of the protest tactics, especially the more disruptive or violent protest tactics. Moving forward, talking about scenarios and potential trigger points in Hong Kong. These protests have been ongoing since May, and even though participation is significantly lower than it was over the summer, they're obviously still going on and they're still quite disruptive. One potential development that would seriously impact the trajectory of the protests and associated disruptions would be a death at one of these protests or clashes. So far, nobody has died at these protests, but given the levels of violence that we've seen, it's certainly not impossible. If a protester were to die at one of these rallies, that would likely galvanize the protest movement, increasing participation in both mainstream protests and more impromptu ad hoc demonstrations. Whereas potentially if a police officer or a counter-protester was killed, that would likely alienate much of the public. By counter-protester, I mean there have been protests by groups of people in support of the government or just broadly opposed to the protest movement. Another factor to keep an eye on is security force posture. The Hong Kong government has specifically ruled out instituting martial law in order to deal with the protests, but of course it's not impossible. An even more remote possibility that a lot of people are concerned about would be the deployment of mainland security forces to crack down on the protests in Hong Kong. That scenario remains extremely unlikely because any deployment by mainland security forces into Hong Kong would likely galvanize the protest movement, whereas the government strategy, both the Hong Kong government and the central Chinese government, is basically to wait these protests out and hope that they lose steam. A factor to keep in mind, though, is October 1st is China's National Day. It is the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So it's a highly symbolic, important date. And lots of the protesters plan to essentially embarrass the authorities by being particularly disruptive on October 1st, whereas many of the pro-government people in Hong Kong are also likely to come out onto the streets on October 1st. So that'll be an important day to keep in mind. Luckily, it is an official holiday in Hong Kong, so that may help to minimize business impacts. But essentially, the most likely scenario going forward is that there won't be, I mentioned here additional concessions. So as I said earlier, there are 4 key demands that the protest movement is maintaining. I think it's possible that the government might grant 1 or 2 of those demands. But in terms of granting all 4, I would say it's next to impossible. So it's a factor to keep in mind. But since the government is highly unlikely to grant all of the protester demands, the protests are likely to continue with some degree of participation over the coming weeks and probably months. So again, I think the dynamics that we've seen of smaller yet more disruptive protests, I think that trend is likely to continue.
Thank you, Brendan. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Roquefort. Tony works as a senior security advisor with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response team. Prior to joining Global Assistance and Response, he was a senior intelligence analyst focused on political violence and armed conflict. He is also a veteran of the U.S. Army Special Forces with experience in counterterrorism, foreign internal defense, and human intelligence operations. Tony is going to discuss precautions for visitors and businesses working in Hong Kong.
Yep. All right. Thanks, Mary. Thanks to Brendan as well. Good afternoon. Good morning. Good afternoon, all. I'll be covering some of the general security recommendations with respect to the ongoing developments in Hong Kong. I'm going to address this early. Yes, if the situation in Hong Kong deteriorates drastically in the coming days or weeks, clients might want to consider restricting all but essential travel to the region, depending on their risk appetite. But as it currently stands, few, if any, clients have implemented any kind of significant restrictions on their travel to Hong Kong. Moving forward, some additional general recommendations from the WorldAware side. We're advising clients to maintain situational awareness at all times, understand what normal looks like right now in Hong Kong. All right, so you can quickly identify any major deviations from that baseline. So liaise with WorldAware through the Access to Analyst program, as well as trusted local contacts. Monitor email alerts, message traffic, and conduct regular calls with your internal emergency response teams and crisis management teams, if you have them in place, to ensure that you have as accurate a depiction of the situation on the ground as possible. Consider implementing a work from home or work from hotel policy. The implied tasks there being to ensure that your organizations have contracts in place with hotels or residential building managers to ensure you have guaranteed access to the living and the workspace that you require. Organizations considering a work from home policy should also ensure personnel are adequately equipped and trained with multiple forms of communication, remote access capability, and backup power supplies. Personnel also need to have access to adequate supplies of food, water, medication, if applicable, and hygiene supplies in the event of prolonged shelter in place. Some kind of prolonged shelter in place is required. If you haven't already done so, now's the time to develop a robust communications plan to ensure you can gain rapid accountability of all personnel operating in Hong Kong if the situation deteriorates. As always, local cell networks, internet providers, and radio platforms spanning multiple frequency bands should serve as the primary and alternate methods of communication. However, as a risk manager, I'm constantly asking myself, what contingency plans have I developed? When it comes to communication specifically, what is our emergency communications plan, or what is sometimes referred to as a no comms plan, for when electronic forms of communication are ineffective or disabled? Does your organization have designated communications windows for safety check-ins? What are the escalation procedures if one window is missed? What happens if two communications windows are missed? Do you know where your people are staying? And do you have mechanisms in place to conduct a physical face-to-face wellness check if needed? We also want to make sure we're preparing for a heightened security posture in the region, including the possibility of curfews should the situation deteriorate. So comply with all instructions from local authorities, and never attempt to bypass any kind of security checkpoint for whatever reason. If departing from or simply passing through Hong Kong, ensure that your people are verifying onward transportation before checking out of their accommodations. And while traveling through Hong Kong, either on foot or in a vehicle, clients should ensure that they plan, memorize, and utilize multiple routes to get from A to B. As always, there's no shortage of stressors that can disrupt travel plans, so ensuring we know where we are at all times, where we need to go, and having multiple ways to get there will help mitigate vulnerabilities during transit. If we understand the layout of the region and we're tracking developments on the ground, we can plan our routes that circumvent common flashpoints or protest sites or other choke point areas. With regards to the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, Brendan and the WorldAware APAC team do a good job mapping these out regularly. So ensure that all stakeholders are reading WorldAware's alerts and studying the attached maps closely. When we're planning our routes, we also want to ensure that we have several safe havens mapped out along each route. With the understanding that this is not always possible, the ideal safe haven is a location that's open 24 hours a day. So taking steps to avoid common flashpoint areas in Hong Kong, common protest sites in Hong Kong, we're looking at shopping centers, coffee shops, public transportation depots, hotel lobbies, and if need be, gas stations. The idea is to allow our people to arrive without any kind of time restriction, and to loiter for long periods while we attempt to coordinate some kind of secure transport back to their hotel, their home, or their office. So when we're looking for safe havens, we're looking for locations that have multiple points of ingress and egress, preferably along 2 or more streets. Proximity to mass transportation is also key, so that personnel can make a hasty exit prior to their link-up time if the situation worsens. Finally, now is as good a time as any for risk managers and EHS personnel in Hong Kong to audit their local emergency response plans. And when I say emergency response plans, I'm specifically referring to those plans designed to meet duty of care requirements and facilitate and organize actions to ensure employee life safety in the event of a workplace emergency. ERPs are location-specific tactical level response to specific stressors. Ideally, ERPs include procedures for reporting an emergency, whether it's an environmental hazard or accidental or adversarial human-caused event, and ERPs include clear action items for personnel impacted by those events. Remember, the number one priority when we're talking about ERP development and implementation is life safety. So ERP should be trained and exercised annually at a minimum. Remember that a plan that is not exercised, that has not been exercised and validated is not a plan at all. So in the course of your audit, should you discover your local ERPs are non-existent or ineffective, ensure you have a sound improvement plan in place so you can avoid relying on ad hoc or informal corrective actions. Risk managers should also take the time now to review any and all applicable insurance policies as well, specifically your business travel accident policies. But remember, when we're talking about life safety events, insurance is just a funding tool. It's not a plan. So as always, if you need help developing your plans, WorldAware is here to help if needed. So do not hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or concerns. And with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you for your time. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Brendan and Tony, and thank you everyone for listening in to our briefing. If you would like more information, please visit us at worldaware.com. Thank you.